Chapter 13. Smooth Sailing. After his surprise election, and after he had recruited Mr. Meinert to his team, Hart's first 7 class periods as director had been exhilarating. It wasn't the 6th grade chorus anymore. It was the chorus according to Hart. No endless rehearsing, no unreasonable demands, and during those first 7 classes, no singing. Chorus had become cool, and the holiday concert was going to prove it. The concert was going to be amazing, fantastic, wonderful, even fun. Hart urged everybody to think big, think free, think bold. He urged everyone to break out of the mold. This holiday concert was going to be one of a kind, once in a lifetime, one for the ages. Hart told the kids they could do it, and they believed him. He was the fearless captain, steering their ship into uncharted waters. The skies were blue, the winds were fair, and the gentle waves rolled on toward the cheerful horizon. It was smooth sailing. Under Hart's command, ideas welled up like a rising tide, and each one was welcomed aboard. Hart smiled and nodded as Jim Barker explained his exciting plan to rearrange the whole auditorium. Jim had diagrams he'd made on his computer. There would be 3 runways out to a stage in the very center of the room, and the chorus would be surrounded by the audience. And there would be lights shining in from everywhere, just like on that talent show on TV. Jim had found only one problem so far. Every seat in the auditorium was bolted to the concrete floor. Hart told Jim to keep thinking. Hart smiled and nodded as Lisa Morton explained how she wanted to fly around the stage on wires like Peter Pan, except dressed up like an angel, or maybe one of Santa's elves, or maybe a snowflake with arms and legs. Hart helped Lisa do some quick internet research, which showed that arrangements for that kind of flying would cost about $12,000, not including the cost of special insurance in case of injury or death. Lisa said she'd talk to her dad about the money. Hart smiled and nodded as Olivia Lambert and Shannon Rhoda described their dance routine. They were 2 of the prettiest girls in 6th grade, and they were in ballet class together, and they wanted to do the dance of the marzipan shepherdesses from the Nutcracker. They already had their costumes, and if the 6th grade orchestra couldn't learn the music in time, they had a CD in a really big boombox, and Shannon's mom had volunteered to start and stop the music at the right places. It sounded like a lot of messing around, but Hart liked the way Shannon kept smiling at him, so he smiled back and kept on nodding. Every day, kids came to him with new ideas, all of them interesting, all of them creative. Kids were even calling him at home to ask for his opinion. Jasmine Royce had prepared a gymnastic routine to the music of Winter Wonderland. 3 guys wanted to come out in costumes and perform the Chipmunk song. 5 girls wanted to dress up like a boy band and do a hip-hop version of Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer. And Captain Hart Evans smiled and nodded and took careful notes in the ship's log, and he promised to give every idea his careful consideration. Hart was glad to have Colleen on board as second in command. She was a practical, no-nonsense person, and she and her staging committee had gotten right to work. They'd come up with good ideas for decoration, simple and doable. There were going to be stars and streamers everywhere, gold and silver, blue and white, red and green, hundreds and hundreds of them, hanging on the curtains, suspended from the ceiling, filling every doorway, covering the walls. The committee had sketches and plans, lists of materials, and a schedule for making everything. It all looked fantastic. Allison Kim was on Colleen's committee, and she had been watching a show on TV about a French circus, Cirque du Soleil. She loved their costumes, so that got her thinking. Some of Allison's plans were pretty strange, and some of her costumes would have been impossible to make. But Colleen and the committee loved one idea. Everyone in the chorus was going to wear a special hat. This headgear with a long piece of coat hanger wire sticking up from behind and looping out in front. A glittery star on a string would hang from the end of every wire. Then, as the chorus walked in, all the boys and girls would be following their own stars. And Allison and the staging committee even came up with a special name for the concert. They wanted to call it Winter Hope. Hart watched as Ross and 2 assistants spent those early days at sea carefully writing the names of holiday songs on the wide chalkboards at the front of the room. The list went on and on. Ross had made 3 big signs, "Please save," so the custodians wouldn't wash away their work at night. The list of songs included old favorites like Jingle Bells and White Christmas and Here Comes Santa Claus. There were Hanukkah songs like I Have a Little Dreidel and Shalom, Children. There were pop tunes like Rockin' Around the Christmas Tree and Feliz Navidad, and traditional carols like Silent Night and The First Noel. And Heather Park and Jeannie Rhee had written some Korean words on the board. They wanted to sing a duet, a Korean Christmas carol. After the third day, Hart had said, "Hey, Ross, your list is getting pretty long." Ross grinned proudly. "Yeah, isn't it great? Over 80 songs, and we're nowhere near done." Hart wanted to remind Ross that there would only be time for 6, 7, maybe 8 songs during the whole concert. But part of being a good captain is knowing what to say to the crew. So Hart gave Ross a slap on the shoulder and said, "Great job, great job." Hart smiled and nodded at Tim Miller as he started to pull his act together. Tim spent a lot of his time trying to figure out whether or not Elvis would wear a beard if he dressed up like Santa. Some days it was yes, some days it was no. Hart smiled and nodded at Mr. Meinert, too, whenever he happened to notice him. Most of the time Hart was too busy, but Mr. Meinert didn't feel left out now. He could see that Hart enjoyed being in charge, and he was fine with that. For now, Mr. Meinert was perfectly content to observe. He watched as Captain Hart Evans set sail, watched as the voyage began. And just like Hart, Mr. Meinert enjoyed those first days at sea. He felt like an invisible stowaway. Whether Mr. Meinert sat at his desk or walked around the room, the kids usually ignored him. They didn't seem to care if he was listening or not. He got to see and hear everything, and he loved all the energy and enthusiasm. The room was never settled, but it was never completely crazy either. These were new waters for him, too, and Mr. Meinert was paying attention. He was learning, and he felt like he was seeing real kids for the first time since he'd become a music teacher. The memories of his first days as a student teacher were still fresh in his mind. He'd been thrown into a room with a huge gang of 7th graders. He had been a little too friendly, a little too timid, and the kids sensed that. They had refused to obey him. They went wild, and after 15 minutes of chaos, 15 minutes that had felt like 10 hours, the regular music teacher had to rush back into the room and restore order. Mr. Meinert had been afraid of losing control of his classroom ever since. That's why his classes had always been so carefully structured, especially the chorus. It was such a large group. Mr. Meinert had always planned every second of every class. He had directed all the activities, and he moved the kids from one task to the next with no breaks, no downtime, no slack. He was able to accomplish a lot, but more importantly, he always had complete control. The chorus, according to Hart, didn't work like that. Was Hart in control? It didn't look like that way. Hart was steering the ship, sort of, but the rest of the kids, they were the ones who kept wind in the sails. And no matter how loud or fast the gale got blowing, Hart never seemed to be afraid. Watching the kids had made Mr. Meinert reconsider his attitude about concerts, too. He had always believed that a school concert should be a polished little gem, a half hour of order and perfection, with no loose ends, nothing left to chance. And who was responsible for each and every detail? Simple. Mr. David Meinert, chorus director. The concerts had been his concerts. He had always felt the presence of his choral professor or the principal or the director of fine arts from the high school. Out there in the audience, someone had always been watching him, judging him. And in his own mind, the big question had always been the same. How can I control this mob of twitchy kids and force them to put on this concert for me? Hart Evans seemed to have a very different idea, if he actually had an idea at all. This thing that was coming on December 22nd, it wasn't going to be a concert. It was going to be more like an event. Mr. Meinert hadn't forgotten his promise to Hart. You can count on me. Even though Hart hadn't asked for anything yet, Mr. Meinert knew he was already helping. He steadied the ship just by being the grown-up in the room. And Mr. Meinert had spoken with Mr. Richards about the student-run concert, and had found the principal to be surprisingly tolerant of the whole idea, even supportive. So the music teacher knew he was playing an important part in the process. True, Hart had loads of natural talent. But after observing for 7 class periods, Mr. Meinert felt pretty sure that sooner or later, Hart's call for help would come.